afternoon. So excited to be on this panel with such excellent fellow scholars and to be at this conference that celebrates such great, fascinating work. Thanks again to all our sponsors and to the PVI for giving us this opportunity to not only conduct our research but also discuss it, which is missing in so much of our other grant work. So this panel is focused on sexual violence. And my paper investigates the options available to the state, so the abstract state with a capital S, vis-a-vis when there is an increased interest in violence against women. This paper builds directly on the first half of my larger research project, also known as my dissertation, that looks at the processes by which violence against women make it to the policy agenda and the consequences of that incorporation into the mainstream public agenda. So I focus here on the consequences, and I argue that the state can in effect spin the issue of violence against women to benefit them, oftentimes at the cost of those very populations that need the most support and attention. They are able to do so when the interest in the issue comes from varied populations or a heterogeneous interest base. Now, why do I say that? So essentially, I'm looking to India and South Asia in a broader sense to evaluate the role of the government in fighting violence against women. India doesn't do great when it comes to security for women. We also don't even necessarily think of the issue in appropriate terms. Modesty and outrage are literally still our legal terms for these issues. This is also partially why I keep saying violence against women instead of gender-based violence. This is part of how the movement is framed right now, and all attempts to shift it towards being about gender-based violence have not succeeded. This isn't necessarily new information. India hasn't been safe for women for many decades now, as is the case in many, many parts of the world. Many have often argued that this is because violence against women remained a feminist concern, not really part of the layperson's lexicon for the large part. December 2012, therefore, changes this calculus for a majority of the Indian population. And that says something because we are talking about a country with 1.3 billion people at last count. So Nirbhaya was a 23-year-old intern student who was gang raped and left to die in a bus in Delhi. Absolutely brutal crime, and a crime that resulted in massive protests like Indian feminists hadn't seen in the history of the women's movement related to women's issues in India, right? So over 70 years. Delhi, the capital where the rape actually happened, came to a standstill for over a month. People stayed on the streets in the cold with water cannons, lathi charges, the works. The police were all out. There were barricades, sister protests in other cities all across the country. The government, after some initial law and order repression, actually responded to these protests. And within 3 months, they completely overhauled the criminal amendment law, which deals with sexual assault in the Indian Penal Code. This is unusual because these overhauls don't just happen, and they definitely don't happen in 3 months, right? Every previous change that did took over a decade, and it was drowned in red tape, which handicapped the women's movement that had even asked for those changes. Small changes, takes a decade, handicaps the women's movement, and then you have this one, which in 3 months completely overhauls the law. What, therefore, motivates this switch by governments to go from an incrementalist 2 steps forward, 1 step back approach to a complete overhaul and mainstreaming of the violence against women legislation? I argue that the representation of new preferences within anti-rape demonstrations allows governments... Oh, yeah, I went back.
It's happened to everyone.
Wait, we're here now. So I'm arguing that the representation of new preferences within anti-rape demonstrations allows governments to find policy options that match their own preferences. So what do I mean by matching preferences? Essentially, I compare feminist demands to mass demands and find that while they all have a shared interest in fighting violence against women, their actual policy preferences differ. And they differ drastically. So in a sense, while most mobilizing around issues of violence against women has historically been organized and led by women's organizations, violence against women as an issue can and does attract a wide variety of constituents or interests: conservative, liberal, old, young, rural, urban. Much of this is centered around the inherent distinction between the conceptualization of women's autonomy and women's honor. So that's the difference that I'm drawing. Are we fighting violence against women because it hurts a fellow human's physical and bodily integrity? Or are we fighting violence against women because in a woman's rape lies the shame of the community, right? So those are like the 2 extreme examples, but depending on where you lie on that opinion, on that spectrum as to why you think rape is bad, as you can imagine, the policy outcomes you would support would be vastly different. This therefore means that violence against women can be framed politically by voices across the political spectrum, right? Creating the space for potential capture by political voices to further their own ends. Doesn't happen all the time. I'm just saying that now you have this opportunity, you have this space that's being created. Some of them, for instance, are the specter of the othered stranger raping women and dishonoring communities allows for the rallying up of support for strategies that protect communities and preserve national honor. These strategies also tend to be ones that deliver more power into the hands of governments and strengthen their hold over society. Furthermore, by acting upon the demand for change in this issue, the state is able to communicate care and concern, thus helping rebut the onslaught of anti-government anger that was directed at them when these rapes happened, and people were unhappy about this issue. So an effective state machinery, therefore, can channel the anger directed at them into proactively building up a state that benefits them. I further find that the state extends the successful deployment of their protectionist narratives to other policy areas in which they have policy preferences that typically haven't found public support by using violence against women as a public shield. So how do I test for this? This project employs a subnational focus because India is just, it's 1.3 billion people, lots of people doing a whole bunch of things, no pattern half the time. So India gives you that kind of leverage. It's lots of fun. So I analyze the national level over time, and then I analyze states over policies to try to see if there's a difference between where states are and what the anti-rape movements look at. I'm presenting only a small section of that over here. Happy to talk about it at any other point of time. So effectively, what I'm looking at over here are the policies that are being deployed across space and time to do with women's issues. So in 2004 and 2009, the issues that you see popping up related to women in the... 2004, 2009, 2014 were national election years. That's why those years. So what I look at are, the issues that are popping up, and I mean, it's not that women's issues aren't popping up, they are, but they're restricted to women's reservation bills. All parties support it. They've been supporting it for the last 20 years. Surprise, it still hasn't happened. Maternal mortality is another big one. Self-help groups. And then very vague references to crimes against women. So that's 2004, 2009, and then 2012, the 2012 bus rape, as it's called, happens. People take to the streets. So the election, 2014 is the first election after that. The election manifestos, the election promises, they get very, very specific by 2014. You're talking CCTVs, so closed circuit, like surveillance cameras, basically, police presence, the use of information technology, fast-track courts, and toilets. I have lots of opinions on toilets after this project, which is not something I would ever thought I would say 3 years ago. So I'll get into a little bit more details about those specific ones, but just a general overview. So interviews and surveys that I conducted in 2015 found that the law, along with other policies that were passed under the aegis of the Ministry of Women and Child's Development, Indian citizens approve of these policies. They support the actions that the government have taken overall. Survey results show, however, that this approval is not consistent across subgroups of the population. Essentially, just to summarize that, because I realize everyone can't read that, men support these policies more than women. Women from the middle and upper middle classes and in urban areas support these policies much more than poorer women, women from rural areas, and younger women. This is where the temporal analysis proves particularly useful, and also what I had to use PVI money for, because it turns out India doesn't actually keep their own election manifestos and election documents. The Library of Congress here does. Yay, bureaucracy. So I've looked at policies that were that were recommended to fight violence against women in the 2014 manifestos, and find that they've actually shown up in one form or the other in other recommendations by the government in previous years and in other sections. So we'll just look at a couple of examples here. So CCTVs have been a constant fixture in all the BJP manifestos. The BJP is our current ruling party, also happens to be a Hindu nationalist party. Pre-2012, they were in the anti-terrorism section. Now they're in the anti-violence against women section. A budgetary analysis, so analysis of budgets that came out from the government, allows us to see where these CCTV cameras are actually being implemented. So we have this thing called the Nirbhaya Fund, which was set up to support anti-violence against women measures in honor of the 2012 gang rape. It was a giant chunk of money. It was 1,000 crores. I don't know how to convert that into dollars, but it's basically a giant chunk of money. The Nirbhaya Fund has been rejecting a whole bunch of applications. So this was supposed to be for anti-violence against women measures. Groups asked for domestic help, domestic violence helplines, shelters, self-defense classes, everything got rejected. However, one application finally made it through in 2016 that got approved, which was to fund CCTV cameras in railway stations and near slums. The railway station project has literally been 8 years in the making. You can go back budgets and see budgets that were submitted. The government's just never got parliamentary funding for this project. However, in 2016, they switched it from being something that was focused on security and terrorism to one that was focused on the prevention of crime against women, and it worked. They drew out half the Nirbhaya fund, half of it is gone. Another example is the use of information technology to fight violence against women, such as phone apps and GPS tracking. These proposals are all centered around the notion that women can map their safe spaces and use their phones to call family, friends, and the police via SOS buttons when needed. There's a move to implement mandatory SOS buttons in any phone that you buy in India. So there'll be an SOS button just on all phones and you can just press it. Except, as Trina's already pointed out to us so well this morning, we all know that often the real threat to women most often lies in the home and with the people they know and trust. So I didn't do the math, but that's over 70% of the women of femicide in this country. It isn't changing that much in India. Additionally, there are proposals which haven't gotten funded yet, but you hear about these in government circles to make it mandatory for rural immigrants to cities to register their phones with the local police because they consider the threat. And one of the bigger problems is we don't know where this data is going to go, who will monitor this data, what the safeguards are against hacking. So we're basically saying let's track all women's movements and anyone can hack it and maybe their families can and who knows. So this is literally this is called the Reliance. So Reliance is one of the biggest telecom providers in India. This is about tracking people, and literally the examples are your daughter is not back from college, your wife is stretching hours at work, your mother is traveling, can't trace your driver, and your friend is late for the party. These are all things that you can now track with your phone if you want. Reliance is a telecom provider, very closely connected with the current government. I went back again. I can talk about all this later. As I've said, I have lots of opinions on this, but essentially what you see is the state capture of political narratives, including those that are centered around resistance. And that's problematic because oftentimes you think of protests and mass protests as being something that will support the cause that it generates. However, you can even see this with the work that's being done that Kyle mentioned, for instance, with August 12. Right now, for instance, thanks to the August 12, there's a Listen First event that's happening this weekend that BLM Charlottesville and Surge are very, very, very upset about, right? Because this whole idea of trying to broaden what it means to have anti-racist organization in this country, and listening is one of the things that people are like, no, this is great. It has a lot of corporate sponsors, a lot of big names are coming. But this is the thing, it starts off as something that starts off as a grassroots movement, can have the potential to be co-opted by a whole bunch of other voices. So consequences for a lot of movements, as it means a certain complicity with state apparatuses. But additionally, it also raises some questions for us about the issue of surveillance as a preemptive measure. And this is complicated for us to say, right? Because sometimes these policies aren't all bad, depending on who you're talking to, right? So these policies that I've suggested, the CCTV cameras, the information technology, even the toilets, I've always been pro-toilet. However, they work for people who look like me. I'm urban, middle class, educated, and have a Brahmin-sounding name, right? An intersectional lens is what throws us into really uncomfortable territory. Because this starts forces us to ask questions of who deserves state protection and who must be reshaped to fit this idea of what a good Indian citizen is, who does get protected, who a curfew will protect, and who a curfew won't protect. So what does citizenship mean in this era, in this new time zone? So those are the questions that this project both raises and grapples with and leaves us with. So I tried to answer them. Don't know if I did. I still have questions. Thank you. I don't know how to get out of it.